Back when I was in college, I had a friend whose dad owned a huge piece of land in eastern Texas. It was around 800 acres. In the past, he had rented it out to hunters and paper companies, but he wasn't doing that anymore. A few years before, he built a cabin on the land, and he let us visit it from time to hang out. It was a perfect escape from school and a way to reconnect with nature. During spring break of 1997, we packed up our trucks and headed to the cabin. We had planned to shoot some guns, drink beer, and do all the other things that people like us do when they get away. The first morning kept us busy with cleaning the cabin and unpacking. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and cracked open some beers. By the time the sun set, we were pretty drunk and passed around a joint or two. At some point during the night, I heard a noise outside. I went to check on it. The fire was almost out, and just outside its light, I thought I saw a man standing completely still. He was facing me, almost like he was waiting for me to do something. I blinked hard, trying to see better, but the dim light and my position made it hard to make out details. The figure didn't move, so I decided to take a few steps closer to get a better look. I was scared, but I couldn't help myself, or maybe I was just too drunk to think straight. I took 2 steps forward when I heard a voice behind me. It was my friend, who had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. He had gotten out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice made me jump, but I recognized it right away. I asked him if he saw the figure by the fire, but he just laughed and said I must have been seeing things. We laughed it off and went back to bed. When I turned to look one last time, the figure was gone. I thought to myself that I was probably just imagining it and fell back asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself that the whole thing was a result of too much fun the night before. We spent the first half of the day fishing at the big pond. After lunch, we shot some guns and practiced with a compound bow one of the guys had just bought. We smoked and drank some more. Later, we tried to play poker, but that didn't last long. We ended up just telling stories around the fire. That night, I went out to the woods to relieve myself. While I was out there, I heard a stick snap nearby and quickly ran back to the fire. The others laughed at me, but I tried to explain what had happened. They reminded me that there were other creatures in the woods, so I accepted that and moved on. Later, we were standing around, deep in conversation, when I turned to talk to the guy on my left. What I saw made me freeze in place. Standing just a few steps behind him was another man, someone I didn't recognize. He had appeared out of nowhere. What was even creepier was that he was staring at my friend, like he was trying to stare into the back of his head. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The longer I looked, the more I realized it was the same figure I had seen the night before. He was average height with a long, messy beard. My friend kept talking, unaware of the stranger standing right behind him. After a long pause, the stranger turned to me, his face emotionless, and walked away. It was then that my friend noticed the look of terror on my face. I pointed and told him everything I had just seen. He and another friend laughed again, dismissing it. They said there was no way I was seeing things. I described the man, and one of them joked that it might have been a Bigfoot. Despite my insistence, no one took me seriously, so I just gave up on trying to convince them. But I wasn't ready to let it go. The mockery just made me more determined to prove that I wasn't imagining things. Over the next couple of days, there was no sign of the stranger, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything unusual. By the 5th morning, I started doubting myself. I had seen this strange man twice, and now he was nowhere to be found. I decided to put the search on hold, at least for now. My friend's dad mentioned that a neighbor who owned land nearby had spotted a group of wild hogs, so we grabbed our rifles and went to track them. About a mile down one of the property's roads, we found some hog wallows, so we knew we were on the right trail. We continued on foot, and after about another mile, we stumbled across 3 large hogs rooting around. We got into position, ready to make our shot. But just as I was about to call the shot, A loud rifle crack echoed through the woods, followed by the sound of a bullet striking a tree just above my friend's head. It took a moment for the realization to hit we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another shot rang out, this time much closer to my friend. We didn't wait for a third. The friend who was being targeted led us down a side trail back to the cabin. But when we got back, the shots started again. We had no choice but to jump in my truck and drive out of there. Back in town, we called the authorities, and after explaining everything, we went back to the property with a few deputies. We approached the cabin carefully, staying in the cars at first. We waited to see if the shots would resume, but nothing happened. The deputies inspected the place and found a few bullet holes in the cabin and another 2 in my friend's windshield. What was even stranger was that all of our gear, including sleeping bags, was scattered all over the ground. Luckily, we had smoked everything the night before, so the police didn't suspect anything. But the box of 3030 ammo was gone, along with my sleeping bag and wool blanket. The deputies suspected that we had stumbled upon a poacher or squatter living on the land. They acted like they were going to let it go, but when my friend's dad heard about it, he insisted they launch a search. That's when I repeated my story about the strange man I'd seen. This time, nobody was laughing. They took my account seriously. The search lasted a week, but they didn't find much. There were only a few old campsites, and it was assumed that the man knew the heat was on and had moved on. During the investigation, they followed some leads like checking for escaped convicts, but the man was never identified. After the shooting incident, we stopped going to the cabin. We tried camping somewhere else, but it didn't feel the same. Eventually, my friend's dad had a heart attack, and he lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land started being used to produce pulp and paper products again. Every time I write down a quick note, I remember those trips, especially that strange and terrifying week that made us stop going. I still talk to my old college friends now and then, and last I heard, they still haven't caught that crazy stranger. We sometimes theorize about where he came from or what happened to him. But when I'm alone, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what he started all those years ago. Although what I'm about to share might sound like something straight out of a typical horror movie, I swear on the truth of what happened. It all started on a very hot July day last year. My car, which is almost 20 years old, has a tendency to overheat on scorching days like this one. However, until I can find a better paying job, it's the only vehicle I've got. On this day, I was driving through some back roads looking for a family of dog breeders a friend had told me about. After several hours of searching, I was nearing the hottest part of the day when my car began to overheat as usual, forcing me to pull over. I picked up my phone to call my girlfriend, only to realize the battery had died. After a few minutes of cursing my bad luck, I realized I needed to find someone with a working phone. This wasn't going to happen unless I started walking soon. I spotted an old farmhouse in the distance and decided to head toward it. What should have been a half-hour walk ended up taking almost an hour due to the blistering heat, and I had to stop multiple times to catch my breath. But eventually, I made it. The area around the house looked more like a junkyard, with old car parts scattered everywhere. I had to maneuver through the debris to reach the front door. I knocked for several minutes but got no answer. Thinking the homeowner might be hard of hearing, I circled the house and peered through the windows, hoping to see someone inside. On the side of the house, I noticed a telephone hanging on the wall just inside the kitchen. Realizing there was a phone, I felt relieved and started calling out, hoping to get someone's attention. Still, there was no response. Just as I was about to give up, I saw a woman lying on a bed inside. I almost banged on the window to get her attention, but I decided against it, fearing I might scare her. Instead, I went to the front door and let myself in. Looking back, that was just as frightening. Before I entered, I pulled out a piece of paper from my notebook and wrote a quick note explaining why I was there. I then called out several times as I made my way toward the bedroom, but still, there was no answer. When I got closer to the woman, her appearance started to unsettle me. She was lying flat on her back, staring blankly at the ceiling. At first, I thought she was just watching the television in the room, but her eyes were completely still. As I got even closer and was just a few steps away, I handed her the note. When the note touched her hand, she didn't react at all. That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. Her face looked unnaturally dry, almost like it had been mummified. Her hair was a very dark black, a color that's rare for older women. She should have noticed by that point, but her eyes stayed fixed. That's when I leaned in closer and looked into her eyes. Instead of the usual slight redness most people have in their eyes, hers had a shiny, glossy look, almost like they were artificial. Despite this, there was no sign of life in her, and I didn't realize for sure she was dead until I actually touched her. I wondered if she was a mannequin, so I reached down and touched her bare hand. Her skin was dry but ice cold. That's when it really hit me just how strange the situation was. Suddenly, a loud creaking noise came from behind me. Without thinking, I bolted out of there, running back toward my car. About half a mile down the road, I ran into an older man in a truck. Thankfully, he agreed to give me a ride back into town. I didn't mention what had just happened, and I kept my answers brief when he tried to make small talk. I didn't want to risk him being involved in what I'd seen. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, and she agreed to meet me at a gas station just outside town. After he dropped me off, I thanked him and he drove away. Once I was safely in my girlfriend's car, I borrowed her phone to call the police. I hadn't told her about what I'd seen, so the shock on her face when I described it showed me that I probably looked the same when I first realized what had happened. The police told me they'd send an officer to check out the house. I then called a tow service to pick up my car. The police never called me back, so 3 days later, I called to ask about their findings. It took a while for someone to get back to me, but when they did, the officer said he and his partner searched the property thoroughly and found nothing out of the ordinary, especially no mummified woman. I thanked them and hung up. What happened after I left the house, I can only guess. The noise behind me was probably the homeowner, and he may have hidden the body, knowing the cops would come. Honestly, I'm not sure what I saw that day. I'm certain I saw a woman lying on that bed, but beyond that, I can't explain it. Several times, I've thought about going back to the house with a camera to prove what happened, but the fear of what else might be waiting for me there has stopped me. If the nightmares about her lifeless eyes continue, though, I might not have a choice. There was no one, no sign of life, just a long, empty dirt road stretching through nowhere. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget how he looked at me. That smile on his face as he chased my car, like he knew something I didn't want to know. I haven't taken a back road since then. It was supposed to be a fresh start. We thought we'd done everything right. No social media, no contact with anyone from our past. We even got rid of our phones, bought an old car with cash, and rented a cabin so far in the woods that the nearest town was over an hour away. We wanted to disappear, but in the end, we were too naive to think we could. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, run-down place with creaky floors and windows that let in the cold. It might have been charming if we weren't living in it, but it had one thing we desperately needed: isolation. No neighbors for miles, just trees and silence. For the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe, even though every night I lay awake, listening for anything out of the ordinary. It had been about 3 months since we left. Life had been quiet, just the two of us. Johann spent his days chopping wood and fixing up the place as best as he could, while I kept my mind busy with cooking and cleaning. anything to avoid the thoughts that kept creeping back. But no matter how peaceful it seemed, that sense of unease never went away. I kept waiting for something to go wrong. That night, I knew something wasn't right the moment the sun went down. It was colder than usual, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old windows. We had finished dinner, and Johann was sitting by the fire, flipping through an old magazine he'd found in a drawer. I was washing dishes, trying to shake off the feeling in my stomach, but it was hard to ignore. I felt restless, like I needed to check outside to make sure everything was still as it should be. I dried my hands and went to the window that faced the driveway. Calling it a driveway was generous. It was really just a dirt path leading up to the cabin, surrounded by thick trees on either side. Nothing moved outside, just shadows swaying in the wind. I was about to turn away when I saw it. A flicker, just noticeable through the trees, but enough to catch my attention. A light. I squinted, trying to focus on where it was coming from. My heart raced when I realized it was a flashlight moving slowly through the trees, coming closer to the cabin. "Johann," I said, my voice shaking more than I meant it to. He didn't look up from his magazine. "Johann, there's someone outside." That got his attention. He stood up, crossing the room quickly, and looked out the window. His face hardened when he saw the light. Without saying a word, he grabbed the shotgun we kept by the wall just in case. "Stay here," he said in a low voice. I wanted to argue, to tell him we should call the police, but we both knew there was no option for that. No phone, no service, no help. We were on our own. I followed him to the door anyway, standing behind him as he cracked it open just enough to step outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. The wind carried the faint sound of voices, barely audible but unmistakable. There was more than one person, and they were getting closer. Johann moved off the porch, staying low as he made his way toward the side of the cabin where the flashlight beam was coming from. I stayed by the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear the voices now, clear, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was a mix of low murmurs and laughter, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl when you know it shouldn't be there. I peeked out from the doorway just enough to see Johann crouching by the side of the cabin, his shotgun raised as he watched the light move through the trees. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Felt like hours, but it was only moments. He looked pale even from a distance. I should have stopped right there. I should have turned the car around or done anything else but keep driving forward. But I didn't. I thought maybe he was in trouble, maybe he needed help. I couldn't just leave someone out there. Could I? It didn't sit right with me, so I kept driving, though I slowed down, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were turning white. When I got close enough, I lowered the window just a crack, maybe an inch or two, enough to hear him but not enough for him to reach inside. The air outside was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. "Hey!" I called out, my voice a bit shaky. "Do you need help?" The man didn't answer. He just stared, his eyes wide open, and there was something in them that made my skin prickle. He didn't move or speak, just kept staring. I was about to roll the window back up when he suddenly took a step closer to the car, his hands still outstretched. "I need a ride," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart was racing, and everything in me was screaming to drive away. But I hesitated. I didn't want to leave him stranded. What if he really did need help? But there was something strange about him, something that didn't seem right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like he didn't belong there, as if he wasn't supposed to be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour. "I don't think I can help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm lost myself." He took another step forward, his hand still reaching out like he expected me to grab it. His eyes never left mine, and there was something in them that chilled me to the core. There was no fear in his eyes, no look of desperation. Just something else, something I couldn't read. "Please," he said softly. "I've been out here a long time." I shook my head, my gut telling me not to trust him. "I'm sorry, I really can't." I rolled up the window all the way, shifted the car into gear, and pressed down on the gas pedal. The car jerked forward, and for a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I could just drive away, leave him behind. But as I passed him, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and what I saw made my heart stop. He was running after me. I floored the gas, the car bouncing over the uneven road, my headlights barely lighting up the path ahead. I looked back again. He was still there, sprinting after the car, his arms pumping, his face twisted into some kind of sick grin. How was he keeping up? I was going at least 30 miles per hour, but he wasn't slowing down. Panic took over, and I pushed the car faster. The engine whined as I swerved around curves, the trees blurring past me. The car struggled to hold the road on the loose dirt, and I was sure I'd crash, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I checked the mirror again, and this time he was gone. I didn't slow down. Couldn't. I kept driving, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know where I was headed. I only knew I had to keep going. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a light ahead. A gas station, small and run down, but the first sign of people I'd seen in miles. I pulled in, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. I jumped out of the car, my legs trembling, and ran inside. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, startled by the way I'd burst in. I must have looked a mess, sweaty, pale, and scared out of my mind. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm, like he'd seen worse. I need help," I managed to say, my voice shaking. There was a man back on the road. The clerk just nodded, like he knew exactly what I was talking about. He didn't ask any questions, didn't look surprised. He simply pointed to a phone on the wall. I called the police, told them what had happened, and they sent someone to check the road. But they didn't find anyone. This is an event that 3 of my friends went through one summer after their junior year in high school. I almost became part of the story myself, but a shift I had scheduled at the local movie theater saved me. They had come to my house earlier that day, asking if I wanted to join them in exploring an area in the woods we hadn't yet checked out. Unfortunately, I had work later that evening, so I had to turn them down. It's been over 25 years since this happened, so not all of it is clear in my mind, but I'll try to recall as much as I can. Looking back, I realize how much things have changed for kids today. When I was growing up, our neighborhood was like a small town, located at the edge of the city limits. Back in the late 60s, a developer with big ideas bought up acres of prairie and forest land far from town and created a small suburban area for the workers who would be needed once factories were built. The factories did arrive, places like Johnson & Johnson and Folgers Coffee, but within 30 years they left just as fast. The children of these workers found themselves isolated from their peers with few places to go, so they took to the nearby woods to explore, much like the early settlers of the area. I was one of those kids, along with my 3 friends. On one of these trips into the woods, without me, they ventured out to the fields on the opposite side of the newly built highway. These fields stretched for miles, and during that summer, they were left untended. Our part of Texas sits between open prairie and wooded areas, so you can walk for miles across flat land only to come across a thick forest. After walking for what seemed like forever, they reached a forested patch none of them had explored before. A path led them to an old barn, and when they went around the corner to check inside, they found the body of a man hanging from a beam. From what they told me afterward, none of them believed at first that it was real, but as they got closer, they realized it was. The man's body was bloated, and he was clearly dead. It turned out he was a truck driver who had parked his big rig at a nearby truck stop around Christmas time. He had walked the 3 miles or so into the woods and taken his own life. No one knows for sure if he had known about the barn or if he just happened upon it. But we do know that on that hot, sticky summer day, his body was a gruesome sight. My friends must have realized that someone was probably missing him, so they went back to the truck stop where he had parked the year before and called the authorities. I didn't hear about any of this until the next day, and although it sounded like an exciting adventure, I'm grateful I wasn't there. Each of them went on to face their own struggles with the law and emotional issues, including battles with addiction. Of the 4 of us, only Stephen is still alive, and he's been in and out of hospitals. The last time we spoke, it was clear he wasn't the same person I had known. I can't say for certain that finding that man's body was the cause of their troubles, but it definitely played a part in it. A table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner were the only things inside. Right away, I noticed there wasn't a phone. Nothing modern, just old furniture and a few lanterns for light. "Go ahead and sit down," he said, gesturing toward the table. "I'll get you some water." I hobbled over to the chair, careful not to put any weight on my ankle. The cabin felt chilly, even though it was still warm outside. I watched as he grabbed a water jug from the counter and poured some into a glass. He placed it in front of me, then sat across the table, just staring at me for a moment. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing around for anything I hadn't noticed before. There was something unsettling about the place. "Where's the phone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No phone," he replied plainly. "Don't need one out here." I felt a tightness in my chest. How am I supposed to call for help? He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I told you we'll figure something out. You're not going anywhere on that ankle tonight." Something about his tone sent a chill through me. I felt trapped. The windows were small, covered with thick curtains, and the door was solid wood, likely heavy to move. I started realizing just how isolated we were. There was no one around for miles. "I really appreciate the help," I said, trying to sound calm. "But I think I should try to get back to the trail. Someone else might come by." He didn't move or blink. "It's late," he said. "No one's coming by now. You should just stay the night." I stared at him, struggling to think of something to say, but my mind was racing. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to get out of there as quickly as I could. But my ankle, I couldn't walk on it. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I can manage." He stood up then, moving around the table toward me, his gaze cold and unreadable. "You're not leaving," he said quietly. "Not tonight." My heart started pounding. I pushed myself up, trying to stand, but my ankle buckled, and I nearly fell. He grabbed my arm, holding me steady, but his grip was too tight, like he wasn't planning to let go. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and threatening. I sat back down, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, not with my ankle like this. I scanned the cabin again, searching for anything that might help, but there was nothing. Just old furniture and the thick walls keeping me inside. He sat down again, watching me intently, the silence heavy and suffocating. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe if I stayed quiet and calm, he'd let his guard down. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized he had no intention of letting me go. Hours passed like that. I pretended to drink the water, but my throat was too dry, too tight. Now and then, he would get up and go to the door, checking it, making sure it was locked. Then he'd sit back down, just staring at me. I felt like a trapped animal, waiting for the inevitable. At one point, he got up and went to the stove, lighting a fire. The room filled with warmth, but it didn't make me feel any safer. He turned toward me, his face lit by the glow, and smiled. "You'll be fine here," he said. "No one's going to find you." My stomach dropped. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. "I need to use the bathroom," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. He pointed to a door at the back of the cabin, his gaze never leaving me. I got up slowly, limping toward the door, my heart racing. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't stay. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and looked around. The bathroom was tiny, just a sink and a toilet with a small window above the sink. It was small, but it was my only chance. I hobbled over, pulled myself up onto the counter, and tried to open the window. It was jammed tight, probably stuck for years. Panic was building in my chest. I pulled harder, putting all my strength into it until finally, it gave way with a loud creak. I froze, listening for any sign that he'd heard, but there was only silence. I squeezed through the window, my ankle throbbing with pain, but I didn't care. I had to escape. The drop to the ground wasn't far, but it was agonizing when I landed. I stifled a scream, forcing myself to stand. I couldn't put weight on my ankle, but I had no choice but to keep moving. I hobbled into the trees, trying to put as much distance between me and the cabin as possible. I had no idea where I was headed, and it didn't matter. I just needed to get away. I could hear him now, yelling from the cabin, but I didn't stop. The trees were dense, and I leaned on them to steady myself, moving as fast as I could manage. I don't know how long I kept going, it felt like hours. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road, and by some miracle, a car was approaching. I waved them down, barely able to speak through the pain and fear. They helped me into the car, and I tried to explain what happened, though I doubt I made much sense. They called the police, and I ended up at the hospital. I never saw that man again, but his face, the way he smiled when he told me no one was coming, will haunt me forever. I was driving across the country, heading from coast to coast. I'd done it before, but this time I took a different route, away from the highways. I was tired of the usual roads, the endless traffic, and all the noise. I thought it might be nice to explore the quieter back roads and see more of the country. That was a mistake. It was getting dark when I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. I wasn't exactly sure when it happened. My phone's GPS had been fine until around midday, but then I lost the signal. The road I was on started to change. What had been a 2-lane asphalt road turned into a narrow dirt path. That wasn't supposed to happen. My map had shown a solid route. I decided to keep going, assuming it would eventually connect back to the main highway. As the sun set, the road only got worse. Trees closed in on both sides, branches reaching out over the road and blocking the last bits of light. It felt like the woods were swallowing me up. I hadn't seen a house, a person, or even another car for miles. Just endless forest. The only sounds were my tires crunching over the gravel and the occasional thud of a rock hitting underneath my car. I was nervous, but the road was too narrow to turn around, and I wasn't about to reverse out of there for who knows how far. My gas was low. Not empty, but low enough that I needed to find my way back soon. The daylight faded fast, and soon it was pitch black. My headlights were on, but they barely helped. The road twisted and turned endlessly, and every time I thought I'd reached the end, another bend would appear. My heart was pounding, that tight feeling in my chest warning me that something was wrong. It was too quiet, too isolated. There was something unsettling about the way the road stretched on. It felt unnatural. I tried to push the feeling aside and focus on driving. Then I saw him. He was standing right in the middle of the road, about 50 feet ahead, just within the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a shadow or maybe a tree, but no, it was a man. He had his hand out like he was trying to flag me down. I slowed to a crawl, my stomach churning. Something about him felt off. He didn't look like a typical hitchhiker or someone lost. His clothes were filthy, like he'd been out here for a long time. His hair was matted, and I could make out his face. I've always been someone who likes hiking solo. It's calming, no noise apart from the sounds of nature. It was a Sunday morning, clear skies, just right to be outside. I packed light, some water, snacks, a map, and my phone. I knew the path pretty well, but it was a long trek through the forest reserve, and I liked having a way to find my way if needed. The first few hours went smoothly, just me and the trees without a single person around. That's what I loved most about it. No interruptions, no one else nearby. The trail was a bit rougher than I remembered, though with lots of roots and uneven ground. I must not have been paying close attention when it happened. One moment I was walking, and the next I was down on the ground. I must have tripped, but all I could think about was the sharp pain shooting up from my ankle. I tried standing up, but my leg gave out. Reaching down, I felt my ankle. It was already swelling up, hot and pulsing. It was bad. I knew then that walking out on my own wasn't an option. I sat there for a while, hoping someone else might come along, but it was a quiet trail, one not many people used, especially on Sundays. I didn't have any luck with my phone either, no signal, of course. I felt the panic rising but tried to keep it down, thinking it was still early and maybe someone would pass by. Maybe an hour or so went by before I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, and at first I wasn't sure if they were real or if I was just imagining things out of hope. But then I saw him. A man, maybe mid-50s, with a scruffy beard and an old baseball cap, coming down the path with a small pack on his back. He spotted me right away and looked a bit surprised to see anyone out there. "You all right?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. I shook my head, explaining what happened, how I couldn't put weight on my ankle and couldn't get a signal on my phone. He looked at my ankle and nodded slowly, then looked back at me. "That looks bad," he said. "You're not walking out on that." I nodded, trying to keep the worry off my face. "Can you help me? Maybe call someone?" He hesitated, which struck me as odd. Just for a second, but I noticed it. Then he scratched his beard and looked around as if thinking. "I don't have a phone with me," he said, "but I've got a cabin not too far from here, just off the trail. I could take you there, and we can figure something out." Something in his tone made me a bit uneasy, but I didn't have much choice. I wasn't moving on my own and didn't want to spend the night out there with no way to get help. "All right," I said. "Are you sure it's nearby? I don't want to be a bother." He smiled a little too broadly. "It's close enough. I'll carry you, you're not too heavy." Before I could say anything more, he was already lifting me up. His hands were rough, and he hoisted me onto his back with ease. For a moment, I felt relieved, thinking maybe I was lucky to find someone. He started walking, stepping off the main trail and going deeper into the forest. As he carried me, I noticed the trees getting denser. We were going further off the path than I'd expected. I tried to make small talk, asking him how long he'd been in the area, how often he came out here. He answered, but his replies were short, like he wasn't that interested in chatting. After what felt like a long time, we reached his cabin. It was small, a single-story structure with a sloped roof nestled among the trees. The wood looked worn, and the windows were dark. There wasn't a car outside or any sign anyone else had been around recently. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. He set me down on the porch and opened the door. Inside, it was just as simple, a single room with a stove and a table. I was driving to a buddy's place, thinking I was taking some back roads in a quiet rural area. I'd left late, which wasn't the smartest choice, but I thought it'd be a quick drive. The GPS kept losing signal, but I figured I knew where I was headed. Turns out I didn't. The road started winding, and soon, I was completely lost, surrounded by nothing but farmland, with no phone signal at all. I kept hoping I'd hit a main road soon, but it was just empty fields and occasional clusters of trees. An hour had passed since the sun went down, and the only light was from my headlights cutting through the darkness on this narrow road, barely wide enough for 2 cars. I hadn't seen a single other car since I'd missed my turn. My gas tank was running low, and I knew I needed to come up with a plan fast. Then, I noticed a faint light up ahead. As I got closer, I saw it was coming from an old farmhouse set back from the road. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in ages, so I figured it was worth a try. I didn't want to bother anyone, but I was getting desperate. I pulled off the road and drove down a rough dirt driveway toward the house. The tires crunched on the gravel, and as I approached, I saw more of the property. The house was very old, with chipped paint and a sagging roof. There were some other buildings too, like a barn and a few sheds, all looking like they hadn't been touched in ages. Inside the house, a single dim light shone through a front window. I parked and got out, instantly feeling the cold night air. The area was silent except for crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked to the door and knocked, feeling nervous but hopeful someone would help. After a moment, the door creaked open and an elderly man appeared. He looked to be in his late 70s, maybe even older, with deep wrinkles on his face and a worn plaid shirt hanging loosely on his thin frame. His gray hair stuck out wildly as if he hadn't combed it in days. His eyes were sharp, and they focused on me as soon as he opened the door. "Evening," he said in a raspy voice. "Lost?" I nodded. "Yeah, I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. My phone's dead, and I was hoping you could give me directions." He didn't respond right away, just looked me over like he was assessing me. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a thin, almost forced smile. "Come on in. Got a map somewhere inside. It's chilly out here. You can warm up too." I hesitated, but he stepped back, holding the door wider. I didn't really have any other options, so I stepped inside. The place smelled old, like dust and something else I couldn't quite identify. The furniture looked ancient, with faded couches and a coffee table covered in old newspapers. There were no family photos or signs of anyone else living there. Just him. He led me into a small kitchen with a table and 2 chairs. The light above the table cast long shadows across the walls. "Sit," he said, pointing to one of the chairs. I sat down, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. There was something unsettling about his slow, deliberate movements. He shuffled through a drawer, muttering to himself before pulling out an old, dusty map and spreading it out on the table in front of me. "Where you headed?" he asked, glancing up at me. I told him the town I was trying to get to, and he nodded, tracing a line with his finger. "You're way off," he said. "I can help you get back on track. But first, how about a drink? You look like you've had a rough night." I was about to decline, but before I could, he had already grabbed a bottle from the counter and poured something into a glass. He handed it to me, the liquid sloshing a bit. "This'll warm you up," he said, his gaze fixed on me. I accepted the glass, though I had no plans to drink it. I just wanted to leave as soon as I could. The air in the room felt thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I noticed the locks. Every window in the kitchen had heavy, thick locks on them, the kind meant to keep something in, and the door I'd entered had 3 deadbolts, all of them secured. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed him locking the door, but it was locked now, nonetheless. I glanced around, trying to stay calm. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice low and watchful. I forced a smile. "No, I just think I should get going." He didn't move, still blocking the doorway. "You sure? You just got here. Why don't you finish your drink? I looked down at the glass, noticing the liquid was darker than I'd expected. My heart pounded, every instinct telling me to get out, but he stood between me and the door. I'm good. Really? I said, slowly standing up. Thanks for the help, but I should go. His smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. Sit down, he said, his voice flat. I froze as he stepped closer, and I backed up, bumping into the table behind me. I said, sit down. I glanced at the door, calculating if I could make it past him. Maybe I could. I didn't sit, I couldn't. I turned and made a break for the back door I'd noticed earlier, leading to the yard. The old man lunged, but I was faster, slamming into the door and fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking, but I finally managed to open it and stumbled outside as he shouted after me. I ran without looking back, the cold night air biting my face as I sprinted across the yard to my car. Thankfully, it was still there. I jumped in, locking the doors, fumbling with the keys until I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I peeled out of the driveway. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing on the porch, watching me with a blank, emotionless expression, as if he'd expected me to run. I didn't stop driving until I was back on a main road, finally seeing the lights of a small town. It took hours for me to calm down, and even now, I can't shake the feeling that he was more than just an old man.